here this morning. I teach a class at Grand Canyon University in the RN to BSN degree program. It's for nurses, and it's focused on ethics and ethical issues in healthcare. The first week of the class, they're asked to consider their world views. Now, most of them would probably never have used that word. We don't think about it because we just kind of take what we think about the world, how we view the world, how we understand the world. In many ways, we take it for granted. But to really be able to articulate it or to more deeply understand what it is for ourselves, the students in the class are asked to reflect upon their view of the higher power or the divinity or God, what that then says about the way that they understand the universe, creation, the way that they understand the human person in reference to that, the way then that they're going to be committed to ethics or ethical ways of responding and acting in the world, and then what that all has to say about the purpose in life. What's the purpose that we have? Why do we get up in the morning? Why do we go through the day? Why do we continue to do what we do? What's our purpose? And it's always interesting to see how they respond to that. Many say that their worldview really came to them by way of being a child or being children, comes from their parents. Or some still say that it came from the way that they were raised in a particular religious community or faith community. Some will be honest about it, that what they had as children in thinking about the world, right? Think back when we were children in the world and what we thought about reality. Although today, I suppose, with the internet and with everything else that we have on computers and that, right? For me being an older person and trying to work technology, ask a 6 or 7-year-old how to do technology, and they know more than we know, right? So their world, children's world today are very different. I had Lincoln Logs. That was the challenge, was to figure out how to do that. I'm sure all the younger people around just kind of look at me crazy and go, Lincoln Logs, what the heck was that? But in any event, when we were children, we had an understanding of the world that in many ways, at least for those of us over 50 and above, was somewhat limited and restricted, right? But now the world is much larger. And so when we grow into adulthood, we have a much different, perhaps, worldview. I remember when I was in the seminary in the Midwest in Indiana, it was hard for me to comprehend that in my class, so this is about 74 to 78, there were still people in my class that had never been west of the Mississippi. And I just kind of went, what? You've never been west of the Mississippi? Well, because for many people, right, did you go very far from home? Did you travel beyond your little community where you were at? Now, I did. I traveled on the airplane with my grandmother. I took many road trips. In fact, the earliest memory that I have is getting on a train. My grandfather had been head red cap at Union Station in St. Louis. And so my grandmother got lifetime travel on trains. Like, that was going to last a very long time, right? Anyway, I was about 5 years old and she packed me up and we got on a train and went out to San Francisco. She had a sister-in-law living out there. And that was just an incredible experience for me. And that perhaps gave me the hunger for travel. So I traveled quite extensively. And we know, right, that when you travel outside of your community, the world does expand in many ways. Or the reaction to things being different than what you are familiar with can be upsetting and disturbing. And then when you return home, you say, well, I'm not going to travel ever again. And this is kind of part of the challenge right now during the pandemic, is trying to travel and trying to interact out there in the world. So it's very different. Maybe in another few years, we'll figure out what difference that made for us. But in any event, consider this. If you remember last week's gospel, Jesus chooses a text out of the prophet Isaiah. And in choosing the text, what he's suggesting is that this is what the worldview of the reign of God is about. Now remember, he's speaking to a Jewish audience that for generations, going back as far as time anybody could remember, they had created or had lived within a worldview that told them how to act, how to behave, what to believe, what to eat, how to dress. That worldview gave them everything that they needed for their identity. But even more so than what it gave them for their identity, it gave them purpose and meaning. And the purpose and meaning was follow the laws, follow the rules, keep the Torah, keep kosher, follow the Sabbath, honor the Sabbath, so forth and so forth. He comes along and he says, well, let me push the boundaries out a little bit, because the worldview of the reign of God is not just what Torah tells us, but what we know about how God works in the world, not just for us in this small community, but how God works in the world for everyone. Now remember, the Israelites, Jews, grew up, lived in the midst of a great diversity of peoples and cultures. And so the way that they could make sure that they maintained their identity was to not close themselves off and not have any interaction with all these other peoples around them, but rather to make sure that when they came home from their interaction, that they still understood who they were, that they still knew what was true, what was right, who God was, who they were in relationship to God, and what they needed to do to maintain that relationship. The fear was that if they interacted too much, that they would lose who they were, and the community would become diluted to the point where then it didn't matter and make any difference. By the way, today we call that postmodernism, where it doesn't really matter what you believe, who you are, where you go, just as long as you stay happy and stay connected and everything's okay. It doesn't matter anymore what identity you have, what commitments, or even what ethics or morality that you carry, because everybody has their morality and ethics, and so everybody, it's all okay, right? That's kind of the attitude. But when Jesus comes to his hometown synagogue, and notice there's a familiarity, as I mentioned last week, there's a familiarity that they have with him. Isn't this Joe's boy? We know him. We know his family. We know all about him. In fact, they probably know more about him than he might know about himself, right? Because when you're a child, what do you know about yourself? What's the earliest memory that you might have when you were a child? Some people can go all the way back. As I said, at 5 years old, I remember getting on the train. Some can't go back much too far, let alone think about what you did yesterday, right? That sometimes we have trouble with that. But there's a familiarity that they have, and they speak well of him. But notice what he goes on to say, because here's the pushing of the boundaries. And it's intentional that it brings discomfort to them. Because, well, what happens is, you see, familiarity breeds contempt. That's a kind of a stock phrase, isn't it? That when you know something so well, it's not only contempt that you might have for anything other than what you believe, but there's also an unwillingness that you develop a deafness, a blindness, a hard-heartedness, if you will, to anything that stands out side of what you believe and what you are committed to. So that familiarity is, well, we just want you, Jesus, to do what you have done everywhere else, right? We're your family, we're your community. Do here what you did in Capernaum, what you did over, we want to benefit from who you are and what you're about, Jesus. So just keep us happy, tell us good things, make us feel good about ourselves. That's all we want, Jesus. In other words, not only do we not want to think outside the box, but we don't want to be pushed too far to consider a different worldview. Because you see, the examples in this text are very interesting. And if you're unfamiliar with the examples, it's best to go back to the Hebrew scriptures, to the books of Samuel, and especially the first and second book of Samuel in the Hebrew scriptures. What's the story about the widow from Sarah and Sidon? Well, again, if you think about it, and see, this is why we can talk about pushing of boundaries, is that there was, in the time of Elijah, a clear demarcation line between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, and all the other peoples or nations, if you will. So Sidon, by the way, is probably one of the most ancient cities in the world. It said that one of the children of Noah founded it. So if you believe in the story of Noah, then you have a way of knowing how ancient the city of Sidon was. But Sidon was also the center of the Canaanites. Those people that had, by the way, it was a question on Jeopardy the other day. Who was the god of the Canaanites? Because it had a double A in it. That was the category. Baal. They said Baal, but Baal. That shook fear into every Israelite that Elijah was crossing that sacred boundary to go into the enemy territory. And whether they really were enemies or not is another question. But to go into that territory, that might mean that Elijah would come back less one of us and more one of them. And God forbid that you came back more one of them, because you could infect the rest of us, just like COVID, right? Get into a large crowd and one person is all it takes, right? Many of you already know that. But notice, if you remember the story, that the widow of Sarah had a daughter and asked Elijah to heal her. This, by the way, is another story in Jesus's time where he is asked to cure someone. Remember the woman? He goes to Sidon, and there's a need for bread, and he has the nerve to say to the mother of the house, "We don't feed the dogs." As if to say, "You're a dog. Why am I going to care about you?" Elijah understands, here's the change in worldview, that the rules and the laws come second when there's a need for healing and for wholeness. And this widow only has one child, and without that child, she has no future. And so Elijah, life goes on, maybe that's more important than the rules and the laws of engagement that prohibit me from interacting with somebody outside of my community. And just look at the next one from Elisha. Naaman the Syrian hears that there's a lot of healing over in Israel. And Naaman the Syrian says, you know, I realize that this boundary might prohibit me from coming over to your community. So just send some dirt from the Holy Land over to my community, and it will be enough to heal me. And Elisha says, no, maybe that boundary, that worldview that restricts the crossing and restricts the access to where God heals is less important than the power of your desire to be healed and God's power to heal. Now remember, even today, the Syrians are enemies of Israel. What? God's going to heal an enemy before God heals us? How is that possible? So when Jesus says to this, the people who believed that they were the only ones who had claimed to God's power, presence, prestige, honor, rightness, that the people sitting in that small community synagogue who believed that they were the true people, the chosen people, as they had been told, are now told that maybe, yes, they're special, but the specialness includes opening up their worldview to be more inclusive without even needing to ask people to be baptized, to carry a green card, or to seek citizenship. That maybe God is saying to us, them, I should say, you know, however you want to take it for today, it's up to you to take this. Hint, hint, hint. That God's not interested in any of those barriers, boundaries that restrict and prohibit access to the presence and power and reality of God in their midst. No wonder they want to throw them out of their community, because they were quite comfortable in thinking the way they did. And Jesus just said, he didn't say that their thinking is wrong. He said your thinking is too small. Your thinking is too narrow. You're not wrong, but you just don't think big enough. And you don't think in such a way that, you know what? God may just heal a Canaanite and a Syrian before God heals you. And you know what? We have to encourage that. Oh my God, that's even more than my worldview might be able to handle. You mean God might be healing those outside before God heals us because we think that our privilege should give us the right to the healing before anybody else gets it? I remember as a kid, it was always this way of wanting to be first. First to get the drink, first in line, first to get to the lunchroom, first. And so what did I do? You know, and you practically knock everybody else down. I remember traveling to England, if you've ever, this was many, many years ago. So as Americans, we just went up to the bus stop and stood at the bus stop, unaware of anybody else. The bus pulled up and we went to get onto the bus first because that's why we were standing where we were. And everybody else in the queue yelled and screamed at us because we had improperly stepped out of the line. Because that's what Americans do. We want to, right? That's what we hear in the rhetoric. First in everything, greatest in everything. No one's going to attack our honor. No one's going to attack our power, our prestige. No one's going to take anything from us because we have a right. City on a hill, power and prestige out of God's providence. If you know any of those connections, you get what I'm saying. Jesus says, guess what, folks? You're not going to be the first. In fact, you're going to be the last. Oh, by the way, your power is not in how big your weapons are, or how many you have, or how fancy your rhetoric is. Your power is in the way you seek the healing of the poor, setting free the oppressed, bringing sight to the blind. There's where your power is. But I don't have anything to show for that. It doesn't get me any more power. It doesn't give me any more prestige. It doesn't put any more bucks in my pocket. In fact, there's going to be less bucks in my pocket because I'm giving it all away. And Jesus says, yes. This is why it's fulfilled now in here. When you choose this new way of thinking, and that's the connector back to Corinthians. This is one of those familiarity breeds contempt readings. We're so familiar with that text from Corinthians because it's used in almost every wedding. And we kind of go, oh, isn't that so wonderful? But if you listen carefully, what it's saying is, you see, the normal worldview is prophecy, speaking in tongues, all of those things gives us power and prestige and a position in the community where we are honored for who we are, what we do, what we have, what we look like, where we walk, what we associate with, and maybe even who we vote for. And Paul, in his wisdom, understanding the vision of Jesus, says, nope. That's not faithfulness to the vision of the reign of God. Think about it. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not put on airs. How many are really willing to follow that path? How many are willing to be more patient with our enemies, more patient with the unvaccinated, more kind and loving, even if the people that we associate with aren't kind and loving to us? He's saying the worldview of the reign of God and what Jesus gives us an insight into is so very different from the norm in which you become comfortable and used to, that it's going to disturb you when you try to make the shifts and the changes required. Because it's going to ask you to give some of your, well, a lot of your privilege up. It's going to ask you to stop thinking of greatness and power and prestige as being more important than being powerless without, rather than at the top being at the bottom. You see how the world is being turned upside down. Now you know why they wanted to get rid of Jesus. We don't like that talk in this place because it means too much of sacrifice for us. And basically they're saying we don't want to make that sacrifice. And Jesus says, okay. And he passes through their midst. And we will get a little insight into where it goes. Because he's going to go to the very people that this vision and worldview means more to than the people who want to stay invested in their old worldview.